This week on The Wheelhouse. Tax reform. Will the 2017 Trump tax cuts be extended? And tax day right around the corner. For Connecticut Public, I'm Frankie Graziano. This is The Wheelhouse. It's the show that connects politics to the people. We got your weekly dose of politics in Connecticut and beyond right here. President Donald Trump's 2017 tax cuts, known as the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, are set to expire at the end of this year. But top Republicans want to extend the program. Will they succeed? And who really benefits from the tax cuts? We're going to try to dig into that this hour. And later, we'll hear how state lawmakers hope to increase access to the ballot in Connecticut. But first, let's talk turkey. Let's talk taxes. Joining me now, Nancy Chen, professor of managerial economics and decision sciences at Northwestern University. Good morning, Nancy.
Good morning, Frankie.
So great to hear from you this morning. Thank you for joining us. Also with us, Dan Haar, senior editor and columnist for Hearst Connecticut Mirror. Good morning. Connecticut Media.
Connecticut. That's a different
I tried to
group.
do Connecticut Mirror and Media.
They are our friends, but that's not where I work.
Yeah, it's like the first time that they're not on the show in a while. So there you go.
Great to be here.
Thank you so much, Dan. I appreciate it. Talking tax cuts this hour. You can too. Join the conversation. 888-720-9677. 888-720-9677. Nancy, let's rewind to 2017, the Trump tax cuts, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. What did it exactly do? And can we tell here 5, 6 years on, 7 years, who benefited most from these cuts?
One of the biggest similarities between what happened in 2017 and now, of course, are tariffs. You know, all the talk of increasing tariffs. And so the earlier Trump administration mostly focused on China. And the idea was that if we increase tariffs on the things that were coming from China, then that would benefit American consumers and American manufacturers. You know, tariffs are just a tax. It means that $10 pair of sneakers or doll that's coming from China, the Chinese need to pay $1. If it's a 10% tax, they have to pay $1 to sell it to Americans. And the hope was that by making that doll $11, it would make American manufacturers more competitive. But unfortunately, what we saw was that dollar of tariffs or taxes was mostly paid for by American importers.
Paid for by American importers. So the tariff issue happens. How did this look like for people across the board, for regular Americans?
So those tariffs didn't last very long. So if we looked at them, after a year, it didn't affect Americans that much. And the reason was because American importers, understanding that American consumers really don't like price increases, they absorbed most of the cost of those tariffs. But had they lasted longer, they wouldn't have been able to do that because, these importers have a bottom line. And at some point, to meet that bottom line, they're going to have to pass that cost on to somebody else. Economists call it a pass-through. So then the big question I think today is, if we impose all these tariffs and if they're long-lasting, will those costs get passed on to American consumers or onto the foreign producers, which is the hope of the administration?
Just saw a post the other day on social media about a farmer talking about skyrocketing costs, and it's not necessarily meaning that the price that he pays for milk or anything like that, or anything goes down, Dan. So that's obviously a concern, I would imagine. Anything you want to add based on listening to what you just heard from Nancy?
No, there's no debate here. This is stuff we learned in Smoot-Hawley, and when was it, in the 30s? This is a ridiculous debate. Every Republican in Congress knows that this doesn't work to this degree. There is a big difference, as our friend Jeff Sonnenfeld at Yale has pointed out in a recent series of articles, really, but one significant one this week. There's a big difference between using tariffs as a tactical tool for targeted industries, specifically steel and aluminum, aluminum and launching this all-out international trade war, which will effectively disassemble the global supply chain.
So the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act expires at the end of this year. There's a great effort underway to get it extended. Do you anticipate that's going to happen?
Well, it's going to happen. The question is to what degree. Will they, for example, extend the estate tax? That's gone up from, I think, 7 million to 14 million exemption. It could go possibly even further. There are details of it that could change like that. Some people want no more increase in the exemptions for people, that sort of thing.
When we talk about tariffs, we talked about somebody incurring a price increase. This will come with a hefty price tag, as I would imagine. What's going to cover that? Is it going to be maybe cutting social services, Medicaid, Social Security? What do you think?
Well, the Congressional Budget Office, which is obviously nonpartisan and perhaps even Republican-leaning right now, has said that there have to be cuts in Medicaid for this to work. Medicaid is obviously, I think it's the biggest program we have, and at least it's the one that would be affected. $880 billion. Is that possible over 10 years? It seems impossible. The cuts could be about 10% of Medicaid, according to my reading of what's coming from CBO.
They need about $880 billion in cuts total, it sounds like. Connecticut, $10 billion in Medicaid last year, as I understand it, in talking to Sean Scanlon and Keith Phaneuf last week. And about $6.27 billion of that comes from the federal government. So the liberal think tank, Nancy, called the Center for American Progress, says extending the Trump tax cuts would, quote, increase upward pressure on the debt to GDP ratio by more than 50%. I have to dumb that down for myself. What will the cuts mean for the economy in the long run?
So, it really depends on where the cuts are coming from. I mean, first of all, I think we want to take all of the numbers that are out there with a grain of salt. These are all estimates based on how businesses and consumers respond, how importers, exporters respond. But whatever it is, it's going to be a big number, and it's going to result in cuts. So how is it going to affect the American economy in the long run? Well, I mean, the cuts themselves, it really depends on what they're cutting. If they start slashing into public education or public health services, these are things that are going to have long-run ramifications on the growth and the development of American children, American students, and the future of the American economy, even though they might not be felt immediately, right? And then just the tariffs themselves and the taxes, the tariffs themselves, which is what we started off with, those in themselves can have a really big long run impact on the American economy. So what the administration is hoping for is that by imposing these tariffs, American manufacturers will be producing more stuff, be able to sell more stuff to be more competitive, because these tariffs, again, they're just taxes, will increase the price of the price that Americans have to pay for whatever they're buying right now, whether it be a doll or a car, right? But what happens when prices go up? People buy less of those things, and they're going to buy fewer Hondas, they're going to buy fewer Fords. And that has an impact on the American economy.
Nancy, we're so blessed to have you on here to break this down. I appreciate it. Give us a call, 888-720-9677. This is an important conversation as we ponder taxes ahead of tax day. 888-720-9677. And, of course, what filing taxes will look like in 2026. An expiration of Trump's tax cuts means an increase for Americans filing taxes in 2026, as I understand it. But is the idea that we'll be paying more in the long run? I give credence to that, but I guess, first off, let me say this. An increase for Americans filing taxes in 2026 if the tax cuts don't go through. Can you hear me, Nancy? I'm wondering if I'm losing you.
Sorry.
Or did I not pose that as a question? I apologize. So my
that was
question,
a
I'll
question
rephrase
for
it.
me.
If the tax cuts don't go through and they expire, if we're not extending the tax cuts, the federal government, I apologize for that. Does that mean that people have to pay more to file taxes in 2026? Or when they're filing their taxes, excuse me.
So I'm gonna defer, or just I'm gonna echo the answer that was given
There
earlier.
you
The
go.
current tax act is a lot of different things, so it really depends on what's being extended, what's not, right? There's many different components here.
We know that some of it, the bulk of it, will be extended. I think, Nancy, you would agree that it's likely we're going to see the ratcheting down that happened in 2017 of the basic schedule of income tax cuts across the board are going to continue. I don't hear any political opposition to that in the Senate. It's a question of how much. Isn't that the case?
That's right, and it's about how we're doing it. So right now, there's a lot of talk of cutting taxes or just getting rid of income taxes for everyone that's earning less than $150,000 per year. Is that going to happen? Is that going to happen? Is that not going to happen? I think it's an open question.
Yeah, there's a really important political point to be made here, which is the Democrats are taking a risk by saying that these are tax cuts for billionaires, tax cuts for multimillionaires. While that is true, and while some 80%, 87% of the 2017 tax cuts did go to top earners, the rest of us do get a tax cut, and people see that. Right, a typical middle-class earner maybe saw, would you say, $1,500 to $1,800 in tax relief. That's not nothing. And so it's a risk for Democrats to keep saying, you're not getting the tax cut, they are.
That's an important distinction, the short term versus the long run. Very important point that Nancy brought up there that I kind of want to expound on. If you cut public health and you cut into public education to fund these, then you may have an issue where people are not as healthy and they're spending more money on health care, obviously out of pocket. And there's a bit of a brain drain. That could be an issue. So that can hurt the economy as well. So let's talk more about the long-term impacts. Can you help us unpack that a little bit, Nancy, and what this could mean for our economy overall?
I think we want to think about the long run impacts from two sides.
Okay.
One is the programs that we're going to cut, which is what we've been talking about, right? Like if we're cutting really important programs for the development of the American population with relation to health and education, that would just be terrible for the economy. That would be terrible for any economy. Just for the obvious reasons. We want healthy, educated people to populate the country, to work, to be productive, to be happy, to have babies, so on and so forth, right? That's just, I think the logic there is obvious.
Populating the country and the economy, yes.
Exactly. Economies are just people, right? The economy, the American economy is the working age population amongst 330 million people. We want them healthy, educated, productive, happy. And so we don't want to cut programs that will undermine that in the long run. So the other angle we want to start thinking about is the things that the administration say they can do in order to raise revenues to compensate for the revenue losses from the tax cuts. And so far, the thing that we're hearing the most about, again, are the tariffs. So the administration says, if we increase tariffs, we can raise a lot of money to fund whatever it is that we're losing from the tax cuts. I think Peter Navarro just the other day said, if we have 20% across the board tariffs on everything and everyone, then we can raise $6.5 trillion or some huge number. Again, these numbers are always ballpark estimates, so we take it with a grain of salt, but let's assume that we can raise a lot of money in the short run. The question is, can we keep raising that money in the long run? Because the tax cuts will result in revenue losses for many years going forward. And here, I think it's really unclear because, again, when you increase the price of imported goods, people are going to start to buy less of it. So maybe this year, we can make a lot of money from tariffs and imports. Next year, people stop buying imports and exporters stop exporting to the US, and we won't be able to make those revenues from tariffs anymore.
But, and that's important too, because then you actually have to stick with the tariffs too over the long run. But it's going to be hard to stick with them if folks won't buy imports.
This is not difficult economic theory. Raising money.
No, it's not, but I am feverishly taking notes.
No, I know. Raising money to run your operations through tariffs is like selling the wood from the joists that you cut out of your attic. to make money on scrap wood. It's completely bananas, and everyone knows it. This is not the way to run a government. This is an attack on government. This is not sustainable. This is what I will say is that we have a lot of predictions of recession right now, right? And that comes from a number of different sources. We don't know exactly what, for example, the tax cuts do to jobs. We don't. The theory is that if you give people more money, it creates more jobs. Lost in this is the idea that the economy doesn't care where a smart investment comes from, whether it's government spending or private spending. The issue is how money is spent once it is in the system. And there's this crazy idea that giving money back to people and not having it spent in the government is necessarily a better form of investment. We've seen some really bad government action lately, and the bureaucracy is clogged. That is true. But tearing it apart and giving it back doesn't necessarily mean it'll be invested wisely.
So where we're going is talking about inflation. And there has been a lot of back and forth nationally and locally as well. We just heard Senator Senator Martin Looney and Senator Bob Duff call out local Republicans talking about some Tesla protests and whether or not people are engaging in I would say they used extreme verbiage, but how they were engaging in protests. And Duff and Looney are saying, hey, why don't you focus on inflation and costs right now? What are you doing to bring costs down locally? So that's what a lot of people want to talk about. They want to talk about inflation and the fact that it is early in an administration, but they're not necessarily seeing costs go down like federal lawmakers said they would.
Well, costs don't come up and down very quickly. You know, I will bring food prices down on day one is a promise that is
or
made.
End a war in 3 hours.
That's right. Yeah, in 3 hours. Those are silly promises, and people should know that. And unfortunately, we have a devolved electorate. The inflation. Tariffs, clearly, as Nancy said, are inflationary. A tax cut may or may not be inflationary. It depends what's done with the money. And it really, there's not a clear answer on whether the tax cuts of 2017 added to inflation. Many people say yes, and some people say no.
Can you help us out with that a little bit, Nancy? Did they add to the inflation issue that we have in America? Too early to tell?
I'm having a hard time hearing you. I didn't hear the last sentence.
I apologize. Can you hear me now? 1, 2, 3.
I can hear you now.
So just really want to, we were talking about inflation and whether or not the tax cuts from 2017 contributed maybe to this issue that we're having right now or to inflation overall. Can you illuminate that for us, that situation?
So I think, the inflation, the extreme inflation that we've experienced in the previous years, most of that isn't really attributed to the tax cuts, right? Most of that is attributed to the COVID-0 pandemic, the disruption in the supply chains, which reduced, the amount of labor and quantity of stuff to make stuff in America. So while, I wouldn't ascribe it, I don't think anyone is ascribing that to earlier tax cuts. It is interesting to point out that the inflationary pressures are also the exact pressures that we would have from some, not all, some of the current policies, things that make imported goods more expensive. So one thing we haven't talked about is how American manufacturers, it's not black and white. It's not that American manufacturers only use American inputs and, Canadian manufacturers only use Canadian inputs.
Yes.
American manufacturers use Canadian inputs. So I live in Illinois. Apparently, we import more from Canada than almost any other state. I'm trying to renovate my home.
Good luck.
But thank you. We're trying to build some bookshelves because my kids are getting older. And I've been told that we expect that the wood it's going to cost 40% more by the end of the year than it does now. So we're kind of like scrambling to get those bookshelves made. And the reason is because the timber comes from Canada, right? So that's an inflationary pressure. It does. It sounds, it reminds me of the pandemic, except it's not the pandemic.
That's right. And it's very important distinction. I love that you brought that up because I just saw a recent NBC News report where they were talking to this manufacturer who makes beer bottles. He makes the beer, obviously, in his factory, but the caps, some of the aluminum comes from Canada. So that is a good point that you're saying that there are multiple cogs in the supply chain here.
Nancy, maybe I might suggest you cut the wood out of the joists in your roof, which is about as logical as this trade war is.
Dan Haar's coming with me the next time that I buy a house to look at the joists.
There you go.
But nonetheless, good luck on that at home improvement. I'm with you. I've been there twice already. President Donald Trump claiming that he wants to encourage more U.S.-based manufacturing. I think you broke this down for us a little bit. Can the United States manufacture everything we're getting from other countries? So you said that it's not necessarily something that's been happening, but is it feasible over the long term that can actually happen where everything's American-made?
The question is not can we. The question is how much will we have to pay for that?
Okay.
And is this something that we want to pay? Does it make sense to pay for that? The question, like, can we? Maybe, because America, is blessed with being huge geographically. It has a huge amount of natural resources, human talent, a strong historical manufacturing base, agricultural lands, so on and so forth. So it's possible that this is one of the few economies in the world that can actually produce everything that Americans need. Maybe. The question is, how much will we have to pay for that? Like, why are we have to ask ourselves, why are we trading at all? Why do we import at all? The reason we're importing stuff from other countries is they can produce it at much cheaper prices than us. I was growing up in the US in the 80s. I don't know like how old you guys are or how old the audience is, but I
Dan
just
Haar's
remember
very
how
Thanks for that,
expensive toys are.
Yes.
I remember, second grade, the summer, my mom was like, if you are really, really good, at the end of the summer, we're going to buy you a pair of roller skates from Walmart. They were $35. This was 1986, rural Alabama, right? $35. Today, I don't know, 30 years later, 40 years later, okay, I'm feeling really old now. Those same roller skates are like $20, $15.
Yeah.
And why is that? Despite inflation, despite everything, they actually caught the sticker prices less. It's because someone somewhere in the world, China, Vietnam, Mexico, is able to produce it at a much lower cost, which means that, we can buy more roller skates. People who can't afford roller skates before can now afford roller skates. That's why we have trade. And so when we increase tariffs, we're increasing the tax on those roller skates. We can keep increasing it until we get to a price point that American producers can manufacture at. They can produce the same pair of roller skates, but I don't know how much that will be, $35, $40. I mean, we'll see when it happens. And then the question for American consumers and voters is, do we like having these manufacturing jobs in America producing roller skates, or do we like to pay $30 less for each pair of roller skates?
The collateral damage that comes from that price seeking is enormous. We shouldn't be making roller skates. It's as simple as that. And we're never going to get to that price point where we can compete with lower cost places. That's the problem.
Something tells me that when folks are rolling down Hole-in-the-Wall Beach in Niantic this summer, they won't be putting on their roller skates the same way ever again, thanks to that fabulous alliteration from Nancy Chen. I appreciate that. You're listening to Nancy Chen, managerial economics and decision sciences at Northwestern University, and Dan Haar, senior editor and columnist for Hearst Connecticut Media. After the break, what President Donald Trump's tax cuts mean for the U.S. economy and Connecticut. You can ask our experts a question. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. We'll see you in a second. This is the Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. You caught me on my phone. on Blue Sky, 888-720-9677, the number to call if you'd like to join us this morning. Join the conversation, 888-720-9677. The Trump administration has put forward a number of tax proposals, including widespread tax cuts and eliminating taxes on tips, overtime, and Social Security benefits. So what impact might these have on our wallets? Still with us, Nancy Chen, James J. O'Connor, professor of managerial economics and decision sciences, and Dan Haar, senior editor and columnist at Hearst, Connecticut Media. Reminder, listeners, you can ask our experts a question about the proposed tax cuts. How are they going to impact us? Can we survive this over the long haul? Give us a call, 888-720-9677. Nancy, again, the number is 888-720-9677. I should slow down sometimes. Nancy, President Donald Trump aims to remove taxes for individuals earning less than $150,000 per year. Newsweek reported that in 2022, 93% of Americans age 15 and over would fall in that bracket. It's a large majority. How are economists thinking about this idea, and how much support is there for this?
So I'm always in support of people getting more for their labor, especially people who are making less money. I think there's general consensus amongst economists, amongst people, that progressive taxation is a good idea for this country. So the thing that's unusual about this tax cut, there are two things that's unusual. One is that the 150,000 threshold is quite high, right? This isn't the bottom half. This is the bottom 93%. So that's a lot of people. So one can ask, is that necessary? It might make these people happier, but do we need that money for some social programs like schooling or health or Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare that we were talking about earlier? And the other thing that's unusual is the threshold, right? It's one thing to have a progressive taxation that, where the tax rates are gradually lower as people earn less money. It's another thing to have just this very crude above and below 150,000. You can ask, why is that not optimal? Well, one reason could be that it's easier to gain. If I'm making $160,000 and this tax cut comes through, then I'll just work less so that I fall under $150,000. And that's not something that we want for the economy.
I understand Dan has some breaking news that related to this. We'll get to this in a second. You're always going to want to follow Dan Haar and CT Insider. But locally, Connecticut Governor Ned Lamont has plans to cut taxes too. What are some of the tax cuts or tax reforms being proposed here in Connecticut?
Well, 2 years ago, the bigger tax reform happened, and that was about about $600 million. The heart of it was the reduction in the tax cuts, unlike what the federal policy is, which is across-the-board tax cuts affecting mostly the rich because that's where the taxes come from. The governor cut only those taxes that at the middle class and the lower earnings areas. So that was the sort of anyone earning under $100,000 had the bulk of the tax cuts. So that's
about how many people is that? We had the bottom 93% that we were talking about federally.
It's most taxpayers, but everybody got a cut in Connecticut. Everybody got a cut. The question was
largest one since the income tax.
Well, that's debatable, and we've had that debate. But the point is that was the heart of it. There was also an increase in the earned income tax credit that goes to low-income earners. And in Connecticut, we now have a situation, I don't know about 150,000, but anyone earning under $50,000 generally does not pay any state tax, either because of the tax schedule itself or because of the earned income tax credit. There also has been an increase in the property tax credit for largely for homeowners, but everybody can take it if they have enough property tax.
So what would be next then? Would it be the property? I know Joe DeLong's been talking about a lot about. Well, is that where we go next?
There's a lot on the table.
CCM, Joe DeLong.
Yes, there's a lot on the table. There are people talking about a child tax credit. That's not likely to happen because of the pressure from the federal government. Connecticut has pressure to not cut taxes. The governor has proposed only a very modest tax cut, essentially an increase in the property tax credit, but only by $50 from $300 to $350 for income eligible people. and some small fees that he's proposed cutting. Democrats in the state Senate, especially, I spoke with Senator Looney, the Senate President pro tem. He would like to see, as always, a capital gains tax cut. That's not going to happen. He'd like to see it. The child tax credit will be debated, but I don't think it's going to happen.
Nancy, let's go back to the federal government here, and maybe a magic accounting strategy, as I understand it. Is there a way? Is this possible to keep the tax cuts without reducing spending elsewhere? Mike Johnson, as I understand it, is open to a plan that makes the cuts appear to cost nothing, thanks to some kind of accounting measure. That's according to Politico. They reported that. Can they actually do that? And how would that work?
So, a lot of people have been doing estimates of how much we're going to gain from the tariffs, how much we're going to lose from the income tax cuts. And, not, the reasonable estimates show quite a lot of losses from the income tax cuts. So, for example, if we're waiving in taxes, if we go to zero for everyone who's earning less than $150,000 per year, if it's only income tax that's subject to this, we're looking at $10 trillion over the next 10 years that the federal government would not be making. If we're doing this income and worker payroll tax, we're looking at $15 trillion, right? And if we think that's how much the government is losing from these tax cuts. So now let's think about how much the government is going to gain from, their revenue earning proposals like tariffs. So the most optimistic number we've had, again from Peter Navarro a couple of days ago, is $6 trillion over the next 10 years. So these are, again, all of these numbers are ballpark, but 6 is not 10, 6 is definitely not 15. So there's a revenue gap. Where is that going to come from? It seems like unless if the US goes into more debt, which the Republicans in Congress really don't want, then we will have to cut spending and public programs.
Would they, for instance, raise the debt ceiling, something that they complained about, I understand it, when Democrats want to do this? Would they, for instance, raise the debt ceiling and then not cut programs and just go ahead with the tax cuts anyway? Is that
So
possible?
I'm not inside the brain of our lawmakers.
But is that is that something that
party.
can actually be done?
I think at this point, anything is possible.
Sure.
They can raise the debt ceiling. They can, because the reason I'm saying that is a lot of things that we don't typically think of as being Republican is being proposed. So, including this income tax cut for everyone under $150,000. I just want to remind everyone that the traditional Republican income tax preference, the libertarians, the proposals from the Bush administration and earlier administrations has been a flat income tax where everyone pays the same percentage, but everyone pays somewhat, right? They have typically been against progressive taxation or, very progressive taxation, and they have been typically against people not paying any taxes. So what we're seeing now is just not what we've seen historically from either party, which is why I say anything's possible.
Wow. That is very important to talk about the fact that we are in unprecedented and uncharted waters. Just want to follow up with you here. If they do kind of go ahead with these strategies, still have that increased pressure on the debt to GDP ratio over time, I would imagine. What are the ramifications of extending the tax cut in a way that essentially zeroes out costs?
I don't think it's possible to extend all these tax cuts without cutting programs. I think what you're asking is, what if we don't cut the programs and we just spend more into debt? We just carry more debt. And I think that, so people have different views on this. So some people think that, it's really, we have to carry a balanced budget. That's terrible. On the other hand, we look at Japan that's been carrying tremendous debt for decades and they just keep chugging along. I think, my view and the view of many economists is that as long as our economy and our government is functioning more than others, so as long as people have confidence in the US economy, we can carry on debt. As long as the US is the safest place for people around the world to put their money, we can carry debt. People will keep buying our treasury bills, people will keep buying our bonds, people will keep investing in the American economy, as long as we look better and safer than other markets.
I was feeling that their butt was coming. Is the butt coming somewhere?
I'll give you one. How
Go
do you
ahead.
expect confidence in the U.S. economy to remain in force? And I agree 100% that that's the key, as long as money keeps coming in. But first of all, the debt levels are at dangerously high levels, and Trump keeps saying that debt is bad, and Republicans keep saying it, and they keep increasing the debt. He increased the debt by $7.8 trillion in the first term. But the point is, if you keep beating up your allies and you launch a global trade war and you are imprecise at all times about what you are doing, that doesn't increase the sort of confidence that we need to maintain that debt.
That's important that Dan just said that, because that's what the Center for American Progress, they are a liberal think tank, but that's what they've been citing a lot of the times. They're looking at the Reagan tax cuts. They're looking at some things that happened in the early 2000s, and they're looking at what that does over time. And you're talking about that 7.8 increase in debt, $7.8 trillion.
I think we have to take a step back here and realize that we are having this discussion about policy as if the goal were to have a stable regime, a stable tax system. That's not. These are people that are trying to attack government spending altogether, not people who are trying to make government work better.
I know, but we're trying to be fair and balanced here, and trying to give the benefit of the doubt to the administration and assume that things are going to go well and do this. But as you guys are saying, it's kind of hard to do that. So what we're saying is it's going to be hard to essentially just spend baby as a strategy, or just zero out the costs. It's going to have to come with cutting programs, and that's still obviously going to hurt people, and it's going to hurt the economy. It sounds like. Nancy, would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. If we're cutting taxes and if we're imposing tariffs, which can raise revenues in the short run, but that's not great for the American economy in the long run, all of that money has to come from somewhere, right? And, and all this discussion of tariffs, we haven't pointed out that, yes, at a very high price for those roller skates, we can bring back roller skating manufacturing into the United States. But even when we do that, because they're higher priced, we will be buying fewer pairs of roller skates. So there will be fewer manufacturing jobs. It's not like we can take all of those jobs making roller skates in Bangladesh or wherever, and we can just move all of those jobs back to the US with tariffs. When we move it back to the US, there will be fewer jobs, right? So all of this is really cost borne by the American consumer, cost borne by debt. Where is that money going to come from?
Dan, we got 30 seconds. I can only go to you on this one. You got some breaking news, I understand it here.
And it
helps us with the tariffs.
Yeah, it does. I just texted the head of the Electric Generators Association. There's been a lot of talk about hydropower. Is it tariff? Is it under a tariff? As of today, with the start of the tariffs, he does not know. This is chaos. Chaos leads to disruption. Disruption leads to recessions. It's not very hard.
Volatility doesn't sound like a good thing. Thank you so much, Dan Haar, for your reporting this hour. Thank you so much for coming on The Wheelhouse.
Great to be here.
CTinsider.com, senior editor and columnist for Hearst Connecticut Media. And, of course, what a fabulous conversation we had with Nancy Chen. I hope you'll come back to The Wheelhouse. I hope you'll eat some pizza with us once you come to Connecticut one of these days. But we'll see you once you get back to America. Thank you for joining us from Rome today.
Thanks. It was my pleasure to be with you guys.
Managerial Economics and Decision Sciences at Northwestern University. Thank you so much for coming on. After the break, how's the state grappling with the need for increased voter access and concerns over ballot fraud? Join the conversation, 888-720-9677. More with Ebong Udama after this break. This is The Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. Right now, Connecticut lawmakers considering several bills that would increase oversight of local elections. Bills a direct response to the ongoing election scandal in Bridgeport that started in 2023. A lot to unpack there. And we're going to do it with a veteran reporter joining us now via Zoom, Ebong Udama. Good morning, Ebong.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm doing even better now that I see you in that dazzling Zoom display that you have. It is very good to talk to you. I want to get right to the questions here. In a recent public hearing, lawmakers in the state general administration and elections committee, they heard testimony on two bills. One's SB 1515, the other's 1516. Those are the numbers. What are they?
I didn't quite follow.
These are the two bills. Sorry, these are the two big bills that they're talking about. As I understand it, one, they're maybe trying to look at whether or not people can get close to voting boxes. Candidates can get closer to the ballot boxes, and then I understand one might involve a monitor. Those are the two big bills.
Yes, there was a monitor. There's a monitor that was appointed for Bridgeport. That's no longer the case now. And so they're trying to see if they can have legislation that would require a monitor to continue in Bridgeport. And there's some pushback on that. But those are the two things. Basically, what has happened is there's a court case that's going on right now involving absentee ballot fraud in Bridgeport. There are 5 people who are on trial, and it was the fact that the absentee ballot boxes had a video surveillance, and it was that video surveillance that was responsible for getting some evidence that was used to actually indict 5 people in Bridgeport for stuffing absentee ballots. And one of them is the vice chair of the Democratic Town Committee, who's a longtime Mayor Joe Ganim supporter and election worker. And basically what they're saying is that, the laws are so that a person cannot put in more than one ballot in the box at the same time, because what we saw was several people putting several ballots into the box at the same time. So that's one of the laws that they're looking at. It would be restricting the amount of ballots you can put in at the same time for a person to put into a ballot.
Back to the monitor part of the conversation. Could you help us understand what a monitor is and does?
Well, what happened in Bridgeport in the last mayoral election was that the state appointed someone to oversee, because normally the election process is controlled by town officials. So what the state did was have someone oversee what the town officials were doing. And that's basically the function of the monitor.
That's the second mayoral primary, as Ebong was alluding to. There had to be 2 because of a scandal. He's talking about 5 Democratic officials charged in Bridgeport facing more than 150 counts of election-related crimes stemming from an absentee ballot scandal, alleged mishandling of ballots that led to not 1 but 2 mayoral primaries. The first one obviously being overturned. These are obviously a direct response to that, and help us understand, too, about maybe even enacting a policy where candidates can only be a certain distance from the ballot box.
That basically what we have on election day is that people cannot. There's a certain distance. If you voted, you've seen that there's a certain distance that people are supposed to stay away from the actual
The 75-foot, the 75-foot rule.
Yeah, and basically, I believe that's what they're trying to do for absentee ballot voting as well.
And it's not like Joe Ganim is in this video as a result of what's happening in this, or whatever candidate from Bridgeport was close to the ballot box. So that doesn't, I guess, directly tie in to what happened there. But
the Republicans are pushing back. They say none of this really does anything. And they are actually pushing back on some of the legislation that would increase voting access and also early voting and same-day registration, which is stuff that the legislature is taking up right now. Because last November, voters went to the ballots and they approved an amendment to the basically amendment to the Constitution that would allow for same-day registration and voting in Connecticut. And so and we also have no excuse absentee voting now. So that's opening up, making it easier for people to vote. And Republicans have been pushing back on that, saying that we already have a situation where absentee ballots are being abused now, and making it easier for everyone to vote absentee is not the way to go.
They're saying the situation is ripe for scandal. Scandal making national news, obviously. U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi, quoted in a Fox News story, as saying she'd like to find out if there's a, quote, larger coordinated effort to defraud voters statewide in Connecticut. Go ahead.
She mentioned that, but she hasn't really done anything about it. What happened was shortly after that, President Donald Trump signed an executive order on voting and elections, and there's been a lot of pushback in Connecticut on that because they feel that the president does not have the authority to get involved in the voting process.
So just lastly, to finish up here, so you told us what Republicans are saying. You talked about the federal government potentially getting involved. Doesn't seem like they may. I want to know whether or not the Attorney General of the state of Connecticut will get involved, as he's being prodded to, number one. And then help me understand what advocates are saying here, like a Bridgeport Generation Now, about these measures. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, let's start with the local advocates like Bridgeport Generation Now. They feel that the Democratic Party in Connecticut is not doing enough to deal with this issue, and they feel that they should do a lot more. However, the governor, Ned Lamont, says they're doing more than enough. They said not that they're doing more than enough. They're doing what they need to do. And that's why we have 5 people on trial right now in Bridgeport for absentee ballot fraud.
And then the Attorney General, William Tong, do we know what he's saying about all this?
I don't think he's getting involved with this.
And he would only necessarily have to get involved, it sounds like, if Pam Bondi were involved. If that happens.
Well, he's really engaged with the Trump administration on so many levels right now, and actually he said that he was pushed back on the fact that the president was trying to get involved in local voting by signing that executive order. Says that the president does not have any authority to get involved in local elections.
Somebody who agrees with that is Stephanie Thomas, and you covered Stephanie Thomas recently. I got to push people to your website at wshu.org, where you'll see that Ebong Udama is a senior reporter there. Go there right now to hear what Stephanie Thomas had to say about the White House and a recent executive order. Ebong Udama, thank you for coming on the Wheelhouse Quick today.
Thank you, Frankie.
Thank you. You're the best. I appreciate it. Today's show, produced by Chloe Wynn. Great show. It was edited by Robin Doyen-Aiken and Meg Dalton. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Thank you so much to Megan Fitzgerald, our visuals team here, and our wonderful operations team as well at Connecticut Public. Thank you to Susan Bell and Bill Sensio as well. Download the Wheelhouse anytime on your favorite podcast app. I'm Frankie Graziano. This is the Wheelhouse. Thank you for listening.